The moment I stepped across that threshold, the air went dead silent. You could hear the fluorescent lights humming over the county seal. My father, Frank, he actually snorted, a low, wet chuckle under his breath like I was putting on a cheap magic show. My mother, Helen, she just shook her head. The same look of mortification she'd worn for 12 years. The look that said, "My daughter is embarrassing this family again." But it was the judge who made me freeze. Judge Hawthorne, an old Navy man himself, he just stared at the dress blue uniform I hadn't pulled out of its moth-eaten chest in nearly 4 years. His hand trembled on his mahogany gavel as he whispered into the microphone, "My God, is that truly Commander Vance?" That, right there, was the first time in my life my parents had ever been silenced because of me. 2 weeks earlier, I was out in the North Carolina heat trying to trim the stubborn sea oats that kept threatening to swallow my porch. Then the mail came, a cream-colored envelope with the official seal of the Bay Harbor Family Court. It wasn't a cheerful holiday card. It was a summons. Case file 93 Alpha 7, Vance versus Vance, petition for property division. At first, I thought it was some kind of sick bureaucratic joke. Then I saw the names. Plaintiffs, Frank and Helen Vance. Defendant, Alexandra Alex Vance. My parents were suing me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just laughed. The kind of dry, hollow laugh you get when you've seen enough absurdity in the world that one more layer of crazy just feels expected. I carried the letter inside, set it on my worn kitchen table, and watched my rescue lab mix, Maverick, limp over and rest his giant block head on my knee. "Guess they finally found another way to talk to me, huh, old boy?" I murmured. It had been 12 years since I walked out the door, straight into Navy boot camp. The last time they saw me, I was wearing a ripped camouflage uniform, fresh out of Bud S., standing a little taller than they liked. Dad hadn't even bothered to show up for the graduation ceremony. Mom sent a single, sterile text message. "We raised a lady, not a soldier." So I stopped expecting them to understand the weight of the trident, the meaning of a deployment, or why I chose the ocean over their suffocating little town. For years, I served quietly. Logistical planning, emergency extractions, sometimes the kind of black ops work the papers never write about. I wasn't a hero, but I was the one who kept the gear moving and the men alive. I carried that pride, silent and heavy, until the day an IED ripped through our convoy in the Straits of Hormuz. I came home with a rebuilt knee, a permanent limp that Maverick and I now shared, and a comfortable medical pension that made civilian life possible but painfully slow. I bought a small place near the coast, fixed it up myself, and tried to forget that their phone never rang. That night, after reading the summons again, I made a pot of tar-black coffee and sat down with my old Navy footlocker. It still smelled faintly of sea salt, diesel, and gun oil. Inside, resting on the folded cotton flag they gave me after my best friend, Chief Petty Officer Lou Hernandez, didn't make it back, was the uniform. Dark wool, polished brass buttons, silver insignia. I hadn't touched it since Lou's funeral. Maybe that's why my hands shook when I lifted the jacket out. Maverick tilted his head, watching me. "Guess they'll finally get a look at who I actually became, won't they?" I said softly, running a hand over the fabric. The next morning, I called the court clerk. "Yes, ma'am," she confirmed, her voice crisp. "Your parents are petitioning to have the family property transferred to them on grounds of abandonment. They claim you defaulted on your familial obligations." Defaulted. I nearly bit through my tongue laughing. Abandonment? I was serving in places they couldn't find on a map. "Ma'am, you'll need to appear in person if you wish to contest it. Abandonment." That word dug deep. That was what Dad had screamed at me the night I enlisted. "You're abandoning your family for some testosterone-fueled fantasy." He'd roared, grease stains dark on his mechanic's hands. "No, Dad," I'd replied. "I'm serving something bigger than myself." He never forgave me for that slight. I drove by the old dock house that afternoon. What was left of it, anyway. The paint was peeling. The small widow's walk on the roof was sagging, and the massive, proud, live oak in the front yard stood half dead. That house belonged to my grandfather, an old Navy Seabee who built it with his own hands after coming back from the Pacific Theater. "Every board's got a story, Alex," he used to tell me. Take care of the wood and it'll take care of you. He'd left it to me in his will, specifically. Now, my parents wanted to erase the one good thing connecting us. I didn't feel anger? Not yet. Just a profound sense of disbelief. Like the people who raised me were willing to commit cultural theft just to prove a point. I found myself opening an old envelope I'd kept hidden, a commendation letter from my commanding officer after my discharge. Commander Vance, you've served with quiet distinction. Remember, honor doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it's just the courage to show up. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I went to the closet, pulled the uniform out again, and started pinning the medals. Each one was a quiet memory being put back in order. Silver Star, Bronze Star with V, Navy Commendation Medal. The next morning, I looked in the mirror. The jacket was tight across the shoulders, but it carried the weight of pride and purpose, the kind that forces you to stand straighter. I thought about wearing civilian clothes, letting them believe the story they'd sold everyone, that I was a broken failure who had stumbled home. No, not this time. I ran a hand through my hair, adjusted the collar, and whispered to my reflection, "Let's end this quietly but honestly." Maverick barked his approval. The morning sun was sharp gold, unwavering, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to face my family. The hearing was called to order. I took my seat across the aisle from them. Our defense table was empty. I didn't hire a lawyer. I didn't need a middleman for this fight. Judge Hawthorne, with his kind eyes and his full white mustache, cleared his throat. I saw that flicker of recognition again before he began. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance," he said, "you're claiming your daughter abandoned her rights to the property?" Dad straightened up like a jack-in-the-box. "Yes, sir. That house has been sitting empty for years. We've paid the upkeep, the insurance, everything." A blatant lie. The automatic property tax transfer had failed when I left active duty, but I'd set up a manual payment every single year since 2013. The judge turned to me. "Commander Vance, do you have a statement?" "Commander." The word hung in the air, heavy and solid. Dad blinked, confusion flickering across his face. Mom's lips parted. She was speechless. "Yes, Your Honor," I said evenly. "I have a few documents." I opened the folder. Receipts, tax statements, including the account numbers, repair invoices with my handwriting. I have maintained this property for over a decade. My parents have not spent a dime on it since my grandfather passed. Dad leaned forward, his face turning the familiar shade of crimson. "You think you can throw that uniform around and make us look bad?" "Robert!" the judge warned. Mom reached over and clutched his arm, whispering, "Stop it!" But he was already past the point of return. He stabbed a finger at me. "You abandoned this family, Alex. You went off to play soldier while your mother and I kept everything respectable." I didn't flinch. I had heard those words before. When I joined, when I re-enlisted, when I couldn't come home for my brother's wedding. "Sir," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through his fury. "I joined the Navy to serve this country, not to abandon you. But you made it clear that I wasn't welcome in your home after that choice." The hearing went on, filled with their accusations. Ungrateful, cold, disrespectful. I barely heard the noise. I'd learned how to tune out static noise in the service. What struck me was how small their anger sounded now. I'd seen men lose limbs and still smile because they believed in something bigger than themselves. And here were my parents, fighting over a dilapidated house that hadn't felt like home in 20 years. Then, the unexpected Judge Hawthorne leaned back in his leather chair. "Commander, forgive me for asking, but are you the same Alexandra Vance recognized by the Secretary of Defense back in 2019? The one who led the urgent Yemen evacuation, earning the Silver Star?" Dad frowned, bewildered. "What evacuation?" I nodded once. "Yes, sir." The judge's voice softened, gaining an edge of steel. "I remember that ceremony, Commander. It was one of the proudest days this state had ever seen." The courtroom went quiet. Dad couldn't speak. Mom just stared at me, her mouth slightly open. When the judge finally spoke, he looked directly at my parents. "This court finds no evidence that Commander Vance abandoned her property or failed her obligations. In fact," he tapped my folder once, "the documentation proves the opposite. Petition denied. The sound of his gavel hitting the wood echoed like a door slamming shut on 2 decades of silence. Dad stood up abruptly. "You can't just—" The bailiff stepped forward, massive and silent. Dad stopped, his shoulders visibly slumping. It was the first time I'd ever seen him look smaller than me. Mom sat there, statue still. I gathered my papers calmly, though my hands were shaking. Not from fear, not from pride, but from release. The kind you get when you've carried something too heavy for too long and finally set it down. As I walked out, the judge spoke quietly, almost to himself, repeating the words that had started the chaos. "My God! Is that truly her?" He wasn't talking to the clerk. He was talking to the father who'd skipped my graduation, the mother who'd looked right past me, and maybe, just maybe, the part of me that had stopped believing any of them ever could see me for who I was. I stepped outside into the blinding Carolina sun. The air smelled like diesel in summer rain. A couple of locals nodded politely as I passed. One old man in a veteran's cap actually saluted. I returned it. In the car, I finally let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maverick was waiting for me at my place. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a home to go back to. Not a house, but a life that was mine alone. I looked in the rearview mirror before driving off. Through the courthouse glass, I saw my parents still sitting there, motionless. Maybe they were remembering, or maybe for the first time they were really seeing me. That night I drove to the dock house again. I walked around the porch with a flashlight, tracing the worn gray boards with my hand. Under the main rail, carved faintly into the wood, were the initials, JSV plus ABV, Grandpa's and mine. I smiled. He'd always said, "Names fade, but values stay." I realized I hadn't come back for revenge. I'd come back to protect what still mattered, his honor, his belief in me. The next morning, I drove to the courthouse again, not for another hearing, but to file one last document. I handed it to the quiet clerk. "What's this?" she asked. "Proof the taxes are current," I said, "and a note for the record, I don't plan to sell it." She nodded slowly. "You're keeping it?" "Yes," I said, "but not for me. For whoever remembers why it was built." Later that afternoon, I saw Dad in the parking lot of the hardware store. He was leaning against his truck, smoking, staring at nothing. When he saw me, his jaw tightened. "You made quite a show yesterday, Commander," he said dryly. "It wasn't a show, Dad," I said, keeping my voice calm. He looked at me, squinting against the light. "You didn't have to wear that uniform." "I didn't wear it for you," I replied. He stared for a long time, then flicked the cigarette into the gravel. "I don't know who you are anymore," he muttered. "That's okay," I said, turning away. "I do." But then I heard his voice again, softer this time, the kind of quiet voice he used when he was alone in the garage. "You're like him, you know. Your grandfather. Too proud for your own good." I paused. For a second, I almost smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." I spent the next few months restoring the house, board by board. Every nail I drove into the wood felt like forgiveness made tangible. The swing creaked gently in the breeze. On a gray Sunday morning, I drove out to my parents' place. Maverick paced nervously in the back seat. When I knocked, Mom opened the door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You came," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "Dinner's at 6, I replied, checking my watch. Didn't want to be late. I found Dad out back, oiling his old Winchester rifle. He didn't look up right away. "Thought you wouldn't show," he grunted. "I almost didn't," I said honestly. We sat in silence for a long time, the rain tapping lightly on the tin roof. Then he set the rifle aside and finally looked straight at me. "You think I was wrong?" he said. "I think you were scared," I replied. "You wanted a daughter who stayed close. You got one who went far." His jaw tightened. "You nearly got yourself killed." "I know," I said. "But I also helped people live." He leaned back, the weight of years settling into his shoulders. "Guess I didn't see it that way." "You didn't want to," I said quietly. It wasn't a fight. It was a conversation. After dinner, as we stood on the porch looking toward the distant horizon where lightning flickered, Dad said quietly, "You remember that night before you left for boot camp? I told you not to go?" I remember, I whispered. I was wrong. The words were simple, but they hit harder than any apology could. He reached into his pocket and handed me something small and worn. Grandpa's old pocket compass. "He left this to me," Dad said. "But I think it belongs to you now." I opened it. The needle still moved, steady and sure. Inside the lid, under the original etching, I could barely make out a faint addition. "Honor is the only direction that never changes." "Thank you, Dad," I managed to say. He nodded once, then put his hand on my shoulder, firm, awkward, real. As I drove away, the porch light stayed on behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror. They were both standing at the door side by side. No waves, no words, but for the first time I didn't need either. I placed the compass on my nightstand beside the neatly folded uniform. That night, I fell asleep knowing the war between us was over. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't come with grand speeches or tears. Sometimes it's just a porch light left on. A few months later, the dock house was complete. The porch had new paint. The old flag Grandpa left me fluttered proudly above the door. When the sun set one crisp autumn evening, a couple of trucks pulled into the driveway. My parents stepped out first, followed by my brother Marcus and his wife, carrying a casserole dish like a white flag. We ate dinner on the new porch. Simple food, laughter that came in small, hesitant waves. At one point, Dad lifted his glass of iced tea, his eyes fixed on me. "To the Vances," he said, his voice thick, "and to the one who finally made us proud." I froze for a second, unsure if I'd heard right. Then I raised my glass. "To the ones who taught me what pride really costs." It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. I realized all that time I thought justice was about being right. Now I understood it was about being honest, and gentle when you finally could be. The next day, I was invited to speak at the local high school for Veterans Week. The principal introduced me. "This is Commander Alex Vance, Navy SEAL, and one of our own." The gym went silent. Teenagers who usually fidgeted sat straight, curious. "I used to think honor was about medals," I began. "Then I learned it's about choices, the ones you make when no one's watching." I told them about Grandpa, about the house, about forgiveness. I didn't mention the courtroom or the pain. They needed to hear that strength isn't the same as anger and that silence can be its own kind of victory. When I finished, the students stood, not out of protocol, but out of respect. That night, back at the dock house, I walked to the porch, sat down, and took Grandpa's compass from my pocket. The needle still pointed steady north. I thought about that day in the courtroom. My father's cynical chuckle, my mother's disbelief, the judge's whisper. If I could go back, I wouldn't change a thing. They needed to see the uniform, not as revenge, but as truth, the visible proof of everything they'd never known about me. And I needed to remember that dignity isn't what you wear. It's what you keep when life tests you. To anyone listening, if you've been misunderstood, if your family turned away, if your silence was mistaken for weakness, don't rush to prove them wrong. Just keep living right. Let time do the talking. And when the day comes to walk back through their door, do it without anger. That's what real honor looks like. If this story reminded you of someone, a parent, a child, a friend you haven't called in years, reach out. Tell them you're still here. And if you believe in second chances, in families that can heal, and in quiet acts of courage, subscribe, share, or simply sit in silence for a moment, and remember that forgiveness too can wear a uniform.